Good evening.
Good evening.
It's wonderful to see you. I'm Gary Adler. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. On behalf of myself, Father Jim Heff, the President of the Institute, and Alton Brooks, Professor of Religion here at USC, I'd like to welcome you to our second speaker of this fall's speaker series. If you don't know about the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, we're an independent, lay-directed organization for ecumenical research that probes and develops the Catholic tradition, all aspects of the Catholic tradition. And we do this as a way to understand religion in general, but particularly religion in the modern world. This series, the idea behind this series, which is generously endowed by Bob and Betty Plumley, welcome again, is meant to bring first-rate scholars to reflect with a public audience on some of the most important themes of the day. This fall series has been about Latino Catholicism, all various elements of Latino Catholicism. Michele's our second speaker, and at the end of the evening, I'll give you a little bit more about our third speaker so that we can see you again, because we would like to. So a couple of announcements as we begin. First things first, if you have anything that looks like this of any size, and they're proliferating in size, so I won't even try to cover them all, please go ahead and turn that off now. After Michele's speech, when we do a Q&A, since all of our lectures are recorded for broadcast later on the web, make sure to wait until I bring a microphone to you to talk. And I'll remind you again at that time about that. And I'm very happy to say that this evening, to introduce one sociologist, we have another sociologist here, Paul Lichterman, who's a professor of sociology and religion here at USC, and the recent author of a terrific book called The Civic Life of American Religion, has come to introduce Michele, who I think I just figured out might have been a graduate school classmate of his. So Paul, welcome.
That was easy. Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Gary's right. I get to introduce a grad school buddy. And I was thinking I haven't done that before. This is a new kind of fun. So it either means I've arrived somewhere or I'm getting old or both. But anyway, it is my pleasure to introduce Michele Dillon, who wears a number of impressive hats. Michele is the professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of New Hampshire. She is also now the president of the SSSR, which stands for Social Science Studies of Religion, right? Close? Yeah,
Close enough.
pretty
Yeah.
close. Okay, I've gone. I've attended. I'm not always good with acronyms, but the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, I'm sorry. There we are. I taught a lot today. Michele has written a lot, a tremendous amount, quite recently having co-authored American Catholics Persisting and Changing. She has a number of other titles to her credit, too. One would be Catholic Identity, Balancing Reason, Faith, and Power. She's the editor of a handbook of the sociology of religion, which I depend on for my sociology of religion undergrad course, so I'm very glad you put the often thankless work into doing an edited volume like that. That's really great. Michele is published very widely in a number of areas related to religion, regarding questions of spirituality, questions regarding religion and health, religion and aging, the question of a post-secular society, as some people are arguing that we've entered a time during which we're no longer trying to pretend that we're not in some way a religiously engaged society. We are post-secular. It is once again, scholars are asking about how religion lives in society instead of waiting for its inevitable demise, which people in my field did for roughly 3 decades. So Michele's part of all sorts of interesting questions going on in social sciences and religion. I could go on with other interesting topics she's working on. I'll just mention she's I think the word is voluminous, a voluminous contributor to different kinds of internet-mediated conversations. I'm very impressed that you have the time to speak on subject matter that we really need to hear in smart but simple language, since there are so many misrepresentations, misunderstandings regarding religion and its place in public life in the United States. So I think with that drum roll, I will give you Michele, and I see the title is projected, so I won't read it because we can all read. Thank you for coming to USC.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Paul, for that nice introduction.
I'll make the slide a little bigger.
Oh, thank you. I'm very thankful to Father Heff for the invitation and to Dr. Adler. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank Mr. and Mrs. Plumley for their generous endowment of this fantastic institute. It's just a great gift to American intellectual life, and I would also say to American Catholicism. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon. You see the title. I have to give full disclosure. I'm really going to be talking about Hispanics, but because I was coming to California, and I remember from my days in graduate school in Berkeley that in California people prefer the term Latino, Latina to Hispanic. But in our research, we tend to use the census definition, which they use the term Hispanic. And I actually did see a Pew Forum study which showed that among those who identify as Hispanic, they actually prefer the term Hispanic. But anyway, with all due respect, I'm using Hispanic, and I know that can be somewhat difficult territory, how we categorize and how we label people. Briefly, just to say, of course, Hispanics have been in America for hundreds of years. Yet, of course, in the last while, our interest in terms of the Hispanic population has grown, in part largely because Hispanics are growing in terms of population in the U.S. The last 2010 census, we see that the vast majority of the growth in the American population is due to Hispanic growth. And so Hispanics themselves have gone from being 12.5% of the American population in 2000 to now being over 16%. And, many of them are not born within the U.S., but obviously come and immigrate here. And not all of them are citizens, which we know in terms of politics and ongoing debates that has relevance. It won't be something that's going to impact too much what I'm going to talk about tonight, but it is part of the demographic. I should say, of course, that Hispanics are highly diverse. I have to apologize really for my discipline in sociology. We like to do group-related analysis. We talk about men as opposed to women. We talk about people from the West as opposed to the East. That's our job. That's sort of our bread and butter. So we talk in terms of race or ethnic background. We tend to group whole peoples together. And clearly, we know that Hispanics as a population are highly diverse. They live in different parts of America. They come from very different regions of Hispanics, the global Hispanic population. They themselves vary in age. Cubans in Miami are a little older than some of the most recent immigrants coming from Mexico to Los Angeles, for example. Puerto Ricans in New York are different from Mexicans in Los Angeles. So wherever we go, there's a lot of diversity. And they also vary in terms of their socioeconomic profile. So there's great variation. There are high levels of poverty as well, documented by lots of studies. Nonetheless, again, that varies. And of course, surprise, surprise, not all Hispanics are Catholic. Sometimes in the public media, we get the impression that if you're Hispanic, you must be Catholic. Just like long ago, if you were Irish, you had to be Catholic. That's almost really true, but there's always been a few Irish who are not Catholic. There are far more Hispanics who are not Catholic. So just to keep that in mind. Nonetheless, almost 2/3, 58%, identify as Catholic. I tend to speak quickly, and I know there's time for questions and answers at the end, but if anyone wants to stop me as I speak for clarification or anything, please feel free to do so. So that's a little bit about Hispanics. Now, what about American Catholicism? We could, of course, spend a whole week of talks and discussions on that exciting topic. I just want to say a few general points which I believe from other studies and from my own work really characterize American Catholicism as opposed to Catholicism in other parts of the world. So just as the Hispanic population within the US is highly diverse, what it means to be Catholic and how Catholics look varies too across the globe. And it's, again, a rapidly changing population, certainly in Africa and Asia today. But American Catholicism stands out in some sense as being quite exciting, in part because it's being Catholic in America. And so going back to the great immigration, of the 19th century, how that impacted the identity of what it means to be Catholic. As we know, and as Paul alluded to, religion is strong, and religion in America in particular is extremely vibrant. And that's a surprise to a lot of people, because there is this long tradition, this assumption in sociology that the more modern a society is, the less religious it should be. America, in many respects, is a highly modern society. We think of it really as being the most modern, notwithstanding some of the problems we might have with that sometimes. But it's nonetheless also really in the Western world the most religious, other than in Ireland. Even though I can tell you that in Ireland, Catholicism is rapidly descending. I was just there a couple of weeks ago and saw with my own eyes. And I think it's going to keep on declining, in part because of a different way of being Catholic, which Americans have carved out for themselves. And that in part is because they've lived in this American culture, which is culturally and historically a Protestant culture, where there's a strong emphasis on the individual, on the rights of the individual, and on personal freedom. One of my favorite books is Nathan Hatch's, a good historian, The Democratization of American Christianity. And what he means by democratization, small d, is that Americans really take seriously the promise of democracy, that each person, each vote, but also this entitlement to self-realization, self-actualization, to collectively and individually determine how you make choices in life. And that impacts people's economic behavior, it impacts people's political behavior, and it certainly also, since at least the American Revolution, impacts people's religious behavior. And so the people's choice, I make up my own mind about what to work at and where to work, who to vote for, but also what to believe and when to believe it and how to show my belief. So there is this, what we might call a strong emphasis in American religion more generally on the principle of individual autonomy, or at least individual independence, because of course autonomy, I know, is sometimes a difficult word, but it's really this independence and my own self-entitled independence. And while there's been a lot of focus on that since the 60s and the so-called cultural radicalism of the 1960s, and that is true, nonetheless, there's lots of historical evidence going back, from the very beginning, even of the 20th century, showing that, a lot of Americans have always felt that it was their own business what they believed and how they believed. And that's certainly much more a Protestant, at least historically, was much more a Protestant sensibility, if you like, rather than a Catholic. But the Catholics have their own tradition, which also gives them a certain autonomy. And in recent history, sociologists tend to have a fairly short-term historical memory, but I apologize to the medievalists and others who are here. But there is a long theological tradition in Catholicism, obviously, of faith and reason. Faith and reason, that reason matters. It's not just blind faith or authority to some blindness of faith or to some other magisterial authority. For example, reason matter and reasoned deliberation, reasoned thought about what it means to be Catholic certainly has a great legitimacy within the Catholic tradition. And in particular, since Vatican II, we're coming up now on the 50th anniversary of the convocation of Vatican II, October. It's Thursday, it's October 11th, right? Right. 50 years ago. This is the watershed event, really a revolutionary event in Catholicism. And I don't think it can be overstated. It's very hard to exaggerate the impact that Vatican II has had on Catholicism, and in particular, I would say, on American Catholicism. And there are many things within the documents of Vatican II, and if you haven't read any of those documents, I really recommend that you just get a set of documents. There's many nice editions, and just take a random page. It's a very empowering message, no matter which section you read or which set of teachings from that. But for sort of sociological purposes, the notion of the church as the people of God, that this was a radical idea in many respects for a lot of Catholics back in 1960, 1965, because even today, many Catholics think of the church as the hierarchy, as the bishops. Whereas what Vatican II, not only did it give us permission to think of the church as the people of God, it obliged us to think of the church as the people of God, that the laity cannot just opt out and say, oh, it's the bishops, it's the clerics, let them make decisions. Vatican II imposed the obligation on ordinary Catholics of taking seriously what it means to be Catholic, what it means to be active in the church, and to bring their faith not only into the church, but beyond the church. did you have a question?
Your quote in the bottom,
Yes.
where's it from?
It's also from the documents of Vatican II. I think it's the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World. Yeah, yes. And so obviously Vatican II emphasized personal conscience and religious freedom. It was really the first time, at least in terms of larger public awareness, that the Church acknowledged the Vatican. These are all the bishops gathered at Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes. Okay. I should know that the Church recognized that the state has its own legitimate autonomy in society, and so does the Church, but they don't have to be beholden to one another, so that each has its own sphere of activity. And that was tremendous, both for the Church, the Catholic Church in America, because it was saying you don't have to kowtow to the state, you don't have to kowtow to Protestant churches, you have your own sphere of activity, but that you can also engage with these spheres. You can have your own opinions as a church. And similarly, for a very different society, such as, for example, Ireland, where really church and state were totally conflated, more or less, as a Catholic nation, for the first time, really, it allowed Irish politicians, for example, to argue that they could put forward laws that would not necessarily be a direct reflection of Catholic teaching. So, for example, laws on divorce, on contraception, or whatever. So this differentiation of church and state has been an amazing marker in terms of the evolution of Catholicism. And then, in particular, this quote that I'm attached to, which sort of captures a lot of what Vatican II stands for, which is really to emphasize that, again, if the church is, as it is, the people of God, then nobody can hide behind some kind of authority within the church. That all people need to have informed consciences, all people need to develop expertise about what it means to be Catholic, and that they have then the freedom to express themselves on these matters. So you can't just sort of be marginalized, have your voice marginalized, but neither can you sort of opt out yourself. That is really an obligation, an active obligation. So it really is, this is sort of, if we want to understand American Catholicism, this is very much the tenor of American Catholicism since at least the 1970s. So today then I want to talk about this survey that I've been part of with Bill D'Antonio, who for many, many years, some of you may know his work. He has done surveys of American Catholics going back to 1987, and he's done these every 5 years. And I joined the team a couple of years ago. And so it's in terms, you don't need to get too worried about the details, but it is what we would call a scientific sample. It's a representative sample of all American Catholics. And what it includes is an oversample of Hispanics, because we recognize that the growing Hispanic presence within American Catholicism, we wanted to have extra Hispanics. As I showed you, there's about 16% of Hispanics in the regular population, but we doubled that in our survey so that we could do meaningful statistical analysis for anyone who wants me to go into some of those methodology details. Now, what is interesting or new about this is that it was done via the internet. Knowledge Network is a company that has panels, representative panels of people that does surveys on all kinds of things. And then people, it's not an opt-in survey where you say, oh yeah, let me click the dots and I can answer this. You have to be selected like you would in any other sample to do it. And in fact, for the first time, it was also able to give them a questionnaire in Spanish. And we know from some of the Pew studies that you get a higher response rate, but also some people are more willing to be more honest and less into sort of obfuscation when they can answer questions in their own language rather than in English. They're just, again, some methodological details. Again, you don't need to worry about this, but it's really just well divided in terms of, as you would expect, in terms of age, gender, region of the country, 25% college graduates. And so it is a good mix of the large-scale American Catholic population, even though, let me emphasize, as many of you know well, that you can go to any Catholic church anywhere within even 3 miles of one another in the same sort of economic and ethnic neighborhood, and you're going to find great diversity. So let me just say that I'm going to be talking in big, broad, painting a broad picture here. We know that congregationalized Catholic churches are very different, even, as I say, within the one area. And that's why, for example, there's a very rich tradition in sociology of ethnographic studies. Paul does a lot of that, but there's getting into the nitty-gritties of the on-ground reality. So some of you will probably be shaking your heads with some of the statistics you're going to see after this, because you'll say, oh, well, that's not true in my parish. And you're probably right. But there is a lot of variation. But overall, what I'm going to talk about tonight, this evening, is this sort of the general sweep of American Catholicism in 2011. And this graph, if you can see, really just to show that with the changes in the American Catholic population, what is really happening is a move from the northeast to the west and the south. So the good old Irish and Italian churches of the East Coast, and which in a sense defined American Catholicism in the late 19th century, are now ceding geographical power and probably other forms of power against their best wishes to a different Catholicism. And that's much, so geographically we see this. And that, of course, for pastors and for church planners and leaders, that raised a lot of questions, because in the Northeast we're shutting churches, we're closing parishes and parish schools, and then in the West and in the Southwest we're looking to build new churches, right? So the population is a problem in the sense that if people move, the church has to move too and reallocate its resources. Never mind talking about in terms of who becomes bishops and priests and all those other important questions. And we see this in particular in a generational prism. So if you look today, this is just in the last 25 years of the study, the old, not old, but the pre-Vatican II generation, those born, I'm no longer young, so, myself. So it's really, I was going to say the old salt and earth, the salt of the earth Catholics that some of you know, those born before 1940, they unfortunately, in some sense, they're dying off, and they're being replaced by this younger generation, the 20-somethings that we call the Millennial generation. And you see that this is a shift. So again, we don't want to overstate generational change. Sociologists here, Flory and Miller and others have talked about that generation helps. We don't want to squeeze all kinds of, again, that categorization point that lots of people within any one generation can vary too. But nonetheless, there is a generational story in American Catholicism, particularly given the watershed event of Vatican II. So there is shifting going on. And so, if you like, the pre-Vatican II Catholics who grew up, in Pius's time, who, were, a very different Catholicism, are now being replaced by these people on their cell phones and YouTube. No longer on cell phones. In fact, they're just twittering or tweeting. So it's a very different world in the space of not that many, decades. So Catholicism, just like all religion, evolves. It's dynamic. And so you see this not only in terms of the ethnic change in the composition of the Catholicism, but how the generations matter too. And so you see this is just another point to emphasize that in terms of the increased ethnicity, the current millennial generation of American Catholics is almost half and half divided between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. That's if you just look at the colors, you can see that there's a lot going on. So another 10 years from now, that'll be even further expanded from going from such a tiny percentage back of the pre-Vatican II generation to today's world. So this reminds us, if we needed reminding, that Catholicism is really changing right in front of our eyes. Overall, Hispanic Catholics tend to be slightly more devout. And again, we can disagree maybe how to measure devoutness, but going to weekly Mass is a core practice of Catholicism. Hispanics, only 60% compared to 49% of non-Hispanics, go monthly. Monthly Mass has become the new weekly in general for all people other than the pre-Vatican II generation. So there has been a decline over the last 50 years, certainly over the last 25 years, in the numbers who are going to Mass weekly. Partly it may be that for many, for several generations or for several decades, people might have overstated, not that they were necessarily lying, but sometimes you think of yourself as a Catholic and then a pollster comes on the phone and says, did you go to Mass on Sunday? You say yes, because you intended to go, or you thought you might have gone, or you went the Sunday before. And I mean this respectfully, because it's part of your identity that's something actually that you do, except, of course, there's many Sundays in any given month that there are other things happening. So monthly, though, has become, at least in terms of Catholic practice, the new sort of more regular practice. And we see that Hispanics are more likely than non-Hispanics to go monthly, even though there's no difference in terms of weekly. So when I say that they're somewhat more devout, it's not that all Hispanics are going to Mass every week. Many more are going on a monthly basis than non-Hispanics. And they're more likely to believe that in transubstantiation. And this is another talk for a whole other evening. We know that lots of Catholics don't know what happens in transubstantiation. Many Catholics believe in it, but don't know that they're supposed to believe in it. Many don't believe in it. It's a lot of interesting material around that. Anyway, Hispanic Catholics are more likely to believe that during the consecration, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. And they're more likely than non-Hispanics to say that the sacraments of the church are essential to their relationship with God. So again, it's not 100%, right? There's going to be, none of these are going to be 100%. It's just only half of Hispanics say it and a third of non-Hispanics. So again, depending on where you're looking, I'm looking at this as a sociologist whatever I find is interesting, if you're a priest, perhaps, or a bishop, you might have a different perspective on some of these numbers, but I don't have to get into that myself. And then if we look, this autonomy that I talked about at the beginning, that a person can be a good Catholic without doing certain things or doing whatever they want to do, this is the American story. And you see that here, for example, that the Hispanics are less likely to agree that one can be a good Catholic without going to weekly Mass, without believing that birth control is a sin, without believing that helping the poor is a core part of the Catholic tradition. But nonetheless, and you don't need to look at all of these items, but it's really looking at the core sort of beliefs in resurrection, for example, as well as the practices such as weekly Mass, and then some of the church's teaching about marriage and divorce, for example, or an abortion. Hispanics are less likely than non-Hispanics to say that one could be a good Catholic and make up your own mind, basically, on those things. Nonetheless, as you can see, there's large percentages of both Hispanics and non-Hispanics take this perspective. And I point out in particular that you can use artificial birth control. This has been one of the most consistent markers of American Catholics' independence going back from the early 70s. I know there's a lot of discussion these days about religious liberty being infringed because of mandates on contraception. Catholics have long made up their mind on that issue. And this is borne out here. So you see this autonomy. Hispanics are less autonomous, if you want to use that term, but nonetheless, both Hispanics and non-Hispanics are equally likely to distance themselves. And similarly, Hispanics are somewhat more deferential to the authority of the church hierarchy. One of the questions we ask is whether individuals, as opposed to church leaders alone, or as opposed to individuals working in collaboration with church leaders, should have the final say about making up their mind about a variety of morals, mostly sexual decisions, contraception, the choice to have an abortion, whether you can remarry without an annulment, non-marital sex, and homosexual activity, even though for many they're all non-marital sex. But what you see is that not on the sexual questions, on non-marital sex and on homosexual activity, they're the same, basically. That's not statistically different. But Hispanics are a little more likely to defer to the church hierarchy rather than say that individuals alone are responsible for the final decision. And again, that's something that we document over 25 years, and you can really see a very steady increase from every 6 years in the percentage of Catholics to say it's the individual should make up their own mind rather than the church leaders. And this is simply to say that while I've emphasized or pointed out that Hispanics tend to be a little bit more devout and a little bit more deferential than the non-Hispanics, here I want to argue that there's actually a consensus. Hispanic Catholics are not going to, in my assessment of our data, to change the character of American Catholicism. Because even though they're more devout a little bit and a little more deferential, the things that they rank as being personally very important follow the same pattern as the things that non-Hispanics rank and have ranked for many years. So basically, the resurrection, that's a core belief, so that's probably good news to some people, is one of the most important things to people. Helping the poor, concern for the poor, a core part of the Church's social justice teaching, Mary, the sacraments. But then these two items here, the authority claimed by the Vatican and the Church's teaching on celibacy, tiny percent, less than a third of both are saying that these, so that here you see this amazing convergence. So it's not as if Hispanic Catholics are somehow going to be standing up and saying, we have to give more deference to the authority of the Vatican, or that we can't even think about or talk about changing the Church's teaching on celibacy. For both non-Hispanic and Hispanic Catholics, these issues are really marginal to their understanding of what Catholicism is, whereas the resurrection, concern for the poor, are at the heart of it. And here, similarly, another question that we ask, what are the most meaningful aspects, or what's very meaningful to you among the many aspects of the Catholic tradition, including the sacraments, Mary, the fact that the Church is a universal tradition? Several of these, it's the same. Again, you see that the Mass is the most important for most, basically, concern for the poor. But then this item in particular, dissent and loyalty, is a way of summarizing one of the questions we asked was that what you value or find meaningful in the Catholic tradition is that you can disagree with aspects of church teaching and still remain a loyal Catholic. Right? Because this is something that we've been finding over the years in all our surveys, and this is something that I myself have written a little bit on. And I personally was stunned to see that it's not just the non-Hispanic Catholics, but also the Hispanic Catholics take that view. So this sort of sense of the identity of what it means to be Catholic And again, then the papacy being that. So it's meaningful. A lot of Catholics disagree with the Pope, but they still value the papacy as a meaningful part, the symbolism and all of that. So again, this sort of points a little bit to the complexity. Just because people disagree with the Pope doesn't mean they don't actually value that part of our tradition. So just bring that. But again, it's convergence. If I was able to draw a line across the tops of those, it basically would be the same things that they prioritize. And then I'm going to skip that. They're all equally committed to the Catholic tradition. But one thing that is different, and this is sort of tapping into some current changes in the American sort of spiritual landscape in general, are these what we might call non-traditional beliefs, even though they're non-traditional, they're traditional to many traditions, but not to Western Christianity. Hispanics are more likely to believe that you can find spiritual energy in rocks or in physical beings beyond the religious, to use yoga as a spiritual practice, and to believe in reincarnation. So even though in an earlier slide, I showed you that Hispanics say that the sacraments of the church are very important to their relationship with God, at the same time, they are much more open than non-Hispanic Catholics to embracing and incorporating what we call these new spiritual practices, such as yoga as a spiritual practice. And that's an interesting dimension to the Hispanic experience. Yes.
Is there an age breakdown in terms of?
It's I don't have that data, but in fact, millennials are not any more likely than non. So it's across the generation. So even though we might expect it indeed to be the younger generation.
Yeah, one thing I think we see here in Los Angeles, you talk about spiritual energy, is that we will see people come from very native cultures. And they bring sort of their native traditions and incorporate them, and that's very prevalent. So I don't really think it's a difference of a new belief. It's really taking their customs and incorporating them into their Catholic faith very much.
Oh, absolutely. It's just that, I mean, for many decades, the Vatican and American hierarchy has tended to be, suppressing some of these elements of native belief and native culture, and trying to, even, some of the rituals around the Blessed Virgin Mary that many ethnic groups have, because they feel that somewhat it threatens maybe the more formal liturgy of the church. But certainly there's good precedent for why. And in fact, the Pope on some of his recent visits, when he went to Cuba and when he was in other parts, he actually acknowledged the importance of this. But the hierarchy tends to be a little nervous about seeing too much of that. But anyway, yes.
There's a lot of people breaking authority here about my instruction.
That's good. So now I don't have to worry about the time.
Quickly, I have two questions. One is, do you have any sense of what people understand by reincarnation?
Well, that's a very good question. People are all over the place on this. I mean, if you ask people, do you believe in life after death? This is a standard
Well, I think a
question.
number of people would probably say life after death. Yeah, I believe in reincarnation.
Well, but no, technically, reincarnation is not life after death.
I agree,
I mean,
but
you know
I'm saying
that,
there's
yeah.
the confusion.
Well, I think this is the issue, and I would say this is one of the sort of limitations with survey research is people are answering questions saying, yes, I strongly agree, or yes, I believe. We need qualitative research to then probe them. But we know for generations that Americans have said, I believe in life after death, but then when you actually probe them, these are very traditional Christians, a lot of them believe that it's not the Christian understanding of life after death.
Let me just say one other thing I had, and I've been troubled with how to phrase the question. So whenever you say, does anybody, who has the final say?
Yes.
As soon as you say final say, I'm going to say, no way.
Right.
But if you had worded the question, I mean, this is a theologian, so it wouldn't work, I know. But if you had said, who has the role to present the official teaching, which is not necessarily the final say, because the doctrine on conscience is, you have the final say.
Right.
That's actually Catholic teaching.
Yes.
So,
but most Catholics don't know that, right? I mean, most Catholics
teaching them,
Well, most Catholics have not been taught that, despite Vatican II and all the good work of many good priests. But I agree, and that's always the issue with question wording. These are complicated theological and sociological matters, but on the other hand, we want to gather data. And what I would say is that then you can track it over time. So these questions on who should have the final say or who should you listen to in terms of these issues, that's been asked since the mid-1980s. And you can, so even though there are different surveys with different samples of people, you still see a sort of a consistent pattern of increase in terms of emphasizing the individual. But I totally agree, and I feel that with all these questions, even when you ask the papacy, what's that? I mean, so when you get behind the meaning, that's why we need to sit down and do in-depth interviews with people to understand what exactly they mean by a lot of these things. And that's why I'm a big believer myself in that kind of research. But at the same time, particularly as populations are changing, we want to get sort of a big picture image of what's going on. But I totally take all of those points. All right, so then just to shift on to the millennial generation that I've told you are sort of the new, this is the future. This is the Catholic Church today, and it's going to be increasingly the future. And some of the students in the class are part of that, in the group tonight are part of that generation. Just a few things to highlight here. I've already mentioned the race issue or ethnicity. There's the Hispanics are a large proportion of that. Draw attention here in terms of marital status. The two sort of lines to look at. A is the numbers of never married, and then the numbers who are living with partner. So Hispanic Catholics in the millennial generation, and I talk about the millennial generation, they're basically those 18 to 31 or so. Again, whether it's 18 to 29 or 18 to 30, but it's 20-something group, are currently likely to be living with partner and to not have been, to have married once, right? At least. Whereas the non-Hispanic, 62% in a sense are single. That's what never married and have never been married and are single now. So that's a very interesting, because we know that the family and marital status is a huge predictor of a lot of things in life in terms of economic outcomes, social outcomes, church outcomes. So that's an interesting gap, if you like, in terms of socio-economic or socio-demographic experience between this young generation of Catholics, between the Hispanics and the non-Hispanics.
I would suggest that that's driven mostly by where women stand in our society today. Our daughter didn't get married until she was 34.
Right.
Went to graduate school.
Right.
We got married when we were 22.
Right.
So I mean that a lot of women are getting themselves established in the professions or
That's right.
before they get married.
Right.
And if you cut it off at 31, you're going to miss a lot of people who might have been married 2 or 3 years later.
Right, and certainly that's right. So, but currently, far more Hispanics have been married than non-Hispanics of this generation. And absolutely the larger demographic in the American public more generally is this postponement of marriage. And it's not even clear that many of those who seem to be postponing marriage are actually ever going to get married. So that's a whole other set of interesting issues. And it does raise issues in terms of church participation, because we know at least throughout the 20th century, if you're married and have children, that's the biggest push for you to go to church. And then in terms of party affiliation, this includes the leaners. This was taken in April 2011, so it's not a snapshot of last week or anything, so don't get too carried away. But again, an interesting divergence here. So Hispanics, including those who are leaning, independents who are leaning, as we categorize them together, are far more likely to affiliate themselves with the Democratic Party, whereas these 20-something non-Hispanics much more so with the Republican Party. And then in terms of education, if you look at the top line, 29% of Hispanics compared to 3% of non-Hispanics have high school or less. That's an amazing gap. And then at the opposite end, 35% of non-Hispanics are college graduates compared to only 9% of the Hispanics. Again, this is this big demographic gulf and gap that is going to have a lot of repercussions, obviously not just for the life chances of Hispanics, but also for then just the whole tenor and nature of the Catholic Church, and putting pressure on church authorities and on parishes. How does one provide resources and minister to this, socioeconomically disadvantaged population? And add in Catholic education. Catholic education has been the big, if you like, one of the big engines of upward mobility of Catholics in the 20th century, of all those early Irish and Italian and Poles and Germans who came and went through Boston College and Georgetown and Notre Dame, not necessarily USC, although USC has many of them too. And that really was their ticket in many respects, that whole structure of schooling from the grade school, from the parochial school, right up to college. And I know Catholic education is declining in general, in terms of the number of opportunities available. But again, it's the Hispanic Catholics are least availing or able to avail of it than the non-Hispanic. So that's, again, a sort of a challenge or tension within, or a challenge, certainly. So then if you look at the millennials, you see, again, more or less the same, the aspects of Catholicism that are very important to them. Some differences with the Hispanic millennials being, more likely, just like the earlier slides I showed you, to emphasize the importance of the resurrection and helping the poor, more devotional aspects such as the rosary. So again, here a gap in terms of devotion, but not a huge gap. right, in terms of the kinds of practices, and at the same time, a similarity in terms of how they rank the importance of all of these items. So it's not as if Hispanic Catholics want to be off saying the rosary, and the other Catholics want to be elevating Mary, the Mother of God, or something. So there's sort of a convergence in terms of their priorities of what's important in terms of the tradition. And similarly, in terms of the meaningfulness of the church and various aspects, fairly similar. Again, slight differences in the direction that you would expect, with Hispanics a little more likely to emphasize the more traditional aspects. But then you see here quite a gulf when it comes to social policy teaching, or what might be called some of the social justice. Overall, Hispanic millennials are supporting and want the bishops to be active in terms of immigration reform, whereas the non-Hispanics is only 21%. So it's, again, this very different gap in lived experience. Immigration reform is not on the minds of a lot of 20-something non-Hispanics, whereas it is obviously on the minds and in the families of many of the Hispanic Catholics. And they also strongly agree with more government funds to help the poor, right? 2/3 versus 1/3. Not much difference here in terms of support for bishops' opposition to same-sex marriage, or in terms of opposition to healthcare reform. We build in questions that are somewhat topical at the time, so this was 2011. But really this gap in terms of immigration and concern for the poor, which are really at the heart of course, Catholic social teaching, and are also very pressing, urgent issues in terms of the Hispanic experience, and also in terms of our larger ethical obligation to the common good. So that's when you compare Hispanic millennials with the non-Hispanic. And then if you just keep the women, we just focus on women, the biggest gap really in all of this data is between young or millennial non-Hispanic women and millennial Hispanic women. Hispanic women of this generation, the 20-something, are the most attached, the most committed, the most loyal of that generation. And the non-Hispanic 20-somethings are quite indifferent, I would say, to the Catholic tradition. So this is really, and this is from the point of view of generational succession, when I mentioned at the beginning that the pre-Vatican II generation, so these are their, I guess, great-granddaughters, they are not going to be the carriers of Catholicism, right? These non-Hispanic 20-something women. It's really going to be the Hispanic 20-something women who are going to refashion Catholicism in terms of what they've understood it to be. So it's quite a gap in terms of, again, I would say sociologically it's interesting, but it also raises a lot of challenges from a pastoral perspective and in terms of how to get women involved in the church. Now, an earlier slide that I used showed about the fact that Catholics can disagree with the church teaching and still remain loyal. Women have always, in every generation, have always been more likely to endorse that, in part, I think, because women, they're the ones who experience the tensions and contradictions over contraception, for example, some of these issues of family life. So they feel that, in a sense, they have to disagree with certain things, but still they're committed to Catholicism. They're more likely than men to, for many years, to say, I'm never going to leave the church. The church is among the most important parts of my life. But what I have documented, I didn't bring those slides for today's talk, is there's been a big decrease over the last 25 years in the percentage of women who actually are committed to the church. Now, a lot of it is driven by this younger generation, the 20-somethings, but even their mothers and those in their 40s and in their 50s, right, they are also distancing themselves from the church. And this is really for the first time, it seems to me from looking at the data, for the first time in American Catholic history, that women are, in a sense, becoming impatient or frustrated or whatever word one wants to use, but they're not as committed to dissenting and staying loyal. Right? And so that's just something to put out there. And in particular, the non-Hispanic 20-something women are in the vanguard of what really has become an indifference. So this indifference, I would say sociologically, is a very different. Dissenting shows that you're engaging with the tradition, that you have read, hopefully, Vatican II documents, that you've taken church teaching seriously, but you disagree with it and have good reasons. But you're engaging, you're contesting, you're committed. Whereas this indifference really is, they don't care. They don't care whether they're Catholic, in a sense. They are, but on other questions like, do I want, younger generations of my family to grow up Catholic? It's not a priority for them, whereas it was for their mothers and their grandmothers and is for the Hispanic millennial women, their peers. And then the final one, basically, you also see this in terms of Vatican authority. And again, this is the same question. So the wording about, who can make, is it the individual as opposed to church leaders alone or dialogue, non-Hispanic women are far more likely, other than, again, artificial birth control, not a huge difference, 57% and 71%, just again reaffirming the settled nature of individual conscience when it comes to contraception. But on these other issues, non-Hispanic women are far more likely in the millennial generation than the Hispanics to emphasize individual priority rather making up their own minds and having the final say. So that's, again, another source of tension within this generation. Right? So you have between Hispanics and non-Hispanics on the social justice issues of immigration and concern for the poor, and then among the women, both in terms of engagement with the tradition, but also in terms of their own individual independence away from the church control, if you like. And so that's finally, what's new. American Catholicism is in transition. Religions evolve, Catholicism evolves. It's a living tradition, so we shouldn't be surprised. I will point out that oftentimes when people talk about the Hispanic, the increase of Hispanic Catholics in the church, some people, including the Pew Religious Forum, will say, oh, well, and lots of others who are glad to find some bad news about the church will say, oh, well, the church would be dead if it were not for Hispanics. That might be true, but I like to also point out that the church wouldn't have become the church it did become had it not been for immigrants in the 19th century. So the church has never been this core. Sometimes we think of the church as just like the deposit of faith, as if it's this some monolithic thing that was always what it was, whatever that is. Whereas immigration has always been a key factor in terms of crafting a particular type of church. And so we're seeing that now it is Hispanics, but the Irish and the Italians and the Poles and others crafted a particular kind of church, over 100 years ago. So this is part of being a living tradition. You adjust, you are resilient, but you also adapt. But there is this changing ethnic, and as I say, the generational composition. The older Catholics who have a very particular kind of devotion and loyalty to the church, and who, by the way, have been very energetic after Vatican II, even though they grew up in a very different church of don't do this, they sort of pay, pray, and obey. They were actually very quick to embrace Vatican II. So, just because they were already well settled in some of their opinions didn't mean that they weren't able to embrace a more interpretive and a more dynamic understanding of Catholicism. But they're now being replaced by this younger generation that I think really are basically indifferent to Catholicism. And then, as I just find those last couple of slides, in terms of the church going forward, there are pressing issues in terms of church-state interaction, the role of the church in the public sphere. What items, what issues, what debates are church officials and church representatives? It don't have to just be church hierarchy. It can be laity in their own parish. To what extent are they going to emphasize issues, and particularly in California, immigration reform? To what extent might that emphasis sort of alienate some non-Hispanic Catholics? Again, if there, so there's variation there. And then also how it is in terms of the larger concerns about the common good. How do we foster the common good? We haven't had much dialogue about that necessarily in our society for the last while. But if Catholics are get more engaged in that debate, will some of their opinions, yes, I think is the answer, yes, some of their opinions will have to necessarily alienate some while impressing others. And that, in a sense, has always been that tension of a church engaged as a public church in certain debates. So, thank you.
Thank you, Michele. We've got some time for question and answer. I'll stand in the back. Put your hand up. Do not talk till I come to you with the microphone, please.
I like a simple question. I strongly agree with the Catholic opposition to abortion. So my question to you is, man has a spirit. When does the spirit comes to the body? During pregnancy, or at the childbirth, or after a few years?
Well, that's an excellent question, and as a sociologist, I don't have to answer it. I would say, obviously this has been a long contested theological and philosophical question for generations. And I'm glad that I didn't choose to be an ethicist, so that I don't have to weigh in on this. But I will say that since Roe v. Wade was legalized in 1973, American public opinion has not really shifted. So despite all the debates and all the money spent on the pro-life, pro-choice, all the arguments, if you look at graphs of public opinion, basically back in the 1970s, 1973, 1975, about 20% of Americans believed that abortion should be always available, period, with no restrictions. Another 20% believed totally it should never be available, and 60% said it should be legal but restricted. And that 60-20-20 has not really changed, despite generational change, despite economic change, despite all the other changes. So that's the sociological answer. I'm sure there are many others who will be happy to, in this room, maybe Father Heft himself, to answer that. And that's the issue with abortion. It's a very complicated moral and philosophical question. But anyway, so I'll just give sort of the sociological answer is that public opinion hasn't shifted on it. Where you do see public opinion changing dramatically has been on same-sex marriage and same-sex rights. And particularly among the younger generation, they really, whether they're highly religious, whether they're evangelical, they don't understand what all the fuss is about same-sex rights in general and same-sex marriage. So there's been a huge shift on same-sex issues, but not on abortion.
One of the things that strikes me about a lot of the studies that are nationwide is that it doesn't necessarily factor in the very real differences, but regional differences in this country. It just seems to me that just looking at some of the numbers that you're showing here, that we've already seen some of the things that you have identified as are happening, since mid-1980s until now. We seem to have seen that strongly happening here. And we're beginning to see in some of our parish meetings and talking to people that there seems to be a backlash, that some of the younger millenniums are really more conservative religiously than their older brothers and sisters and maybe moms and dads, and that we're getting that kind of a churning up that changes some of these pictures significantly. I wonder if you see that any other part of the country, or are we kind of unique on that?
Well, I think, yes, there's some, and there's mostly sort of anecdotal evidence that there are, and particularly in college campuses, in fact, where there is such a variation and variety of possible religious and spiritual options, that many, and they're not just Catholics, but let's say Catholics, who grew up in relatively religiously, in different families, are now sort of seeking a Catholicism, seeking an identity. So we don't have good data on that, but I think there is in general, not a push, but I would say much more opportunity in American society today than even 20 years ago to be religious, right? And to be spiritual, right? And of course, alongside that, though, while people are trying to rediscover their religious roots, there's also this increase in the non-church-based spirituality. And I think many, and it's probably evident on USC campus, many young people who are religious are mixing lots of different traditions together. So a little Buddhism here, a little, Tay's prayer there, and all that. So, and that's actually enriching for them. So, because it allows them to, I don't think it necessarily, personally, as a sociologist, I think we've data that would show that it's not necessarily diluting. I know church leaders, and Father Heft is looking at me, but it's...
You don't want your son to do
well, that's beyond my control. That I don't think it's necessarily dilution of faith. It can actually be enriching of one of the other. And I would argue that the challenge to, for example, Catholic pastors and religious leaders is, given this spiritual hunger, that's not just among the younger generation, but among 50-somethings and 70-somethings, why not harness some of the great spiritual resources within Catholicism, the meditation of St. Francis, of St. Ignatius, all of these, the rule of St. Benedict. The Catholic tradition is all of these great spiritual resources that they've tended to hide, or unless you're involved in some very specialized group, you don't know about them. So I think it raises challenges. But yeah, I think a backlash, or whatever you want, a rediscovery of one religion is not a surprise. And I should say, with any trend that goes down, it doesn't mean it's always going to continue going down. I would also point that out. And I think the story of American religion, in many respects through the 20th century and into the first decade of this century, yes, there's been a precipitous decline in the percentage who say I have any religious affiliation. That's one of the biggest pieces of news in American sociology, is that for many decades, about 7% of Americans said they had no religious affiliation. But from the 1990s onward, that has been precipitously increasing. So now about 18, 19% say they have no affiliation. That doesn't mean that they don't believe. A lot of them still believe in God and in life after death and these traditional things. But But that doesn't mean it's going to keep going down, because there is this, if you don't want to call it backlash, currents and countercurrents. And I think American religion, in part because it is such a diverse society and has this long tradition of, many religions sort of living side by side, that people feel being religious is an important part of their identity. It doesn't mean that they're going to be totally committed to it, but it's part of who they are, even though they'll move and shop around within that. So.
When I graduated from the law school of this university 45 years ago, we had 10 women in our class of 170. Now the enrollment is on the order of 60% female. Clearly, women have advanced in every activity in the United States, but in the church, they're right back where they were 300 years ago. And it occurs to me the most recent fight between whoever issued that manifesto from Rome and the Catholic nuns is an example of a greater gap being formed as to what is the role of women going forward. But I didn't see that as an issue that was put to either the Hispanics or non-Hispanics per se.
Well, that's because I didn't put it up today. That's one of my other favorite topics, but it can be dangerous, but I do think that's part of the reason why there has been a decline in women's commitment to the church across generations. So even if we just exclude the millennials, that these other Catholic women are no longer saying, I will never leave the church, or are not going to mass as often. I do think, and that's based on data I hope that I've seen and looked at, is that Catholic women have a history of being very dedicated to the church. And some years ago, I interviewed people who were members of Women's Ordination Conference, for example. And they were not, I thought actually starting out the study that they were all going to be using this sort of rights language. It's my right as an American to be a priest. About 2% use that language. Not that there's anything wrong with individual rights language, but they were arguing this is what Scripture teaches. They were referencing early church history about the role of women, in the resurrection and these kinds of things. They were referencing the church's emphasis on equality, on universality. So they were really using what I would call very Catholic arguments in favor of why women should be priests, in a sense. And many theologians, I said the vast majority of the members of the Catholic Theological Society would say that there's no good theological reason against women's ordination. So I think women do see that they have so much power, they're Supreme Court justices, secretaries of state, whatever. But I don't think it's just a power issue, but I think it's just that they do feel that they can't keep waiting and persevering in their commitment to the church while they see really no progress. And I think over the last few years, we definitely, and even this year alone, there has been really an overreach, in my assessment, of church hierarchical authority. And there's a whole list of things. It was the nuns, Sister Margaret Farley, who's a feminist theologian, they went after the Girl Scouts. There's just a whole load of things. So I think that is putting a lot of women off, frankly.
I'd like to go back for a second to the business of who has the final say. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I think this is so important is because in our culture, individual freedom is so strong. As a consequence, the thing I say to students when this comes up is, I put it this way: in facing any major decision, you alone must make up your mind, but you should never make it up alone. In other words, you get a second opinion, you try to think about it. It's not independence or in the language of the day, socialism or collectivism on the one hand or the individual on the other, is the way it's painted up politically, but it's interdependence.
Right.
So that's what I think in the surveys. I wish there was some way you could get at that. You got it?
The question wording actually is, I should have said is it's not just, they say the individual taking into account church teachings. Because that's why even the word autonomy, because I know today we understand the word autonomy, I can do whatever I want to do. And that's not true, right? Autonomy means that you're always in community, that no man is an island, no one is totally free. And it really is an informed conscience has to be engaged with church teaching. So that actually is in the wording. It's a very long question, but it really does ask the individual taking into account church teachings. So I'm not making that up on the spot. I can actually send you the question because I should have said it earlier. Yeah, because that's right. And that's why, it's independence. It is this moral. But then, of course, I'm sure there are some Catholics who make up their own minds without paying attention. So there's that issue as well. So to the actual teaching.
Yeah, I'm curious if the survey has any information on how Latino or Hispanic Catholics think about involvement of congregations in political causes, either locally through community organizing or more nationally. And part of the reason I ask is being in California, quite a lot of the community organizing constituency, people who fight for more local goods for low-income neighborhoods, are the standard line is that they're Latino Catholics. Catholic congregations are heavily represented in those kinds of efforts. And priests are leading them, but then I wonder, what about in general? I mean, I'm trying to think of, some of the things you can do with survey research that you can't do with the kinds of methods I use, is get the broader picture of what about Hispanic Catholics in general? Does it actually turn out, there's some people are really into this in the congregations that are involved in these kinds of local campaigns, but in general, Hispanic Catholics are no more interested in that kind of social change activism at the congregational level than Protestants or anyone else. Do you have?
We don't have that specific question. So that's, in a sense, that question is really an attitudinal one about, do you support bishops' involvement in immigration reform? And I think we would infer from that a lot of Hispanic, we know, right, that a lot of Hispanic churches are doing that. But it doesn't mean, again, as to your point about political engagement, people often wish for certain things, and on an attitudinal item can say yes or strongly agree, but it doesn't mean that they themselves are going to fight. So that's an important question that you raised, that, our Hispanic, I think it's true, probably if you could measure it. And I'm sure, there is one of the offices of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has a special office for Latino ministry. And they probably have actual numbers on how many. I'm not sure that they do, but they're very involved, obviously, in the pastoral care. But if you're going to do pastoral care and pastoral outreach to Hispanics, it has to include some of this political engagement. That might be a resource, but yeah, we haven't asked this. That's good.
One of the major ways of characterizing Hispanic Catholics in America, really in all the Americas these days, is their flight from Catholic worship and institutions to evangelical and Pentecostal communities, looking for a more spirited, a more personal encounter in worship, etc. But little was said about that in your presentation, and I was just wondering if you could overlay that reality against the survey data in terms of what we'll be seeing in the near future.
Well, we actually have a whole series of questions on people's engagement with their parish. And, because, as probably many of you here know, the size, there's fewer priests. As we know, there's a tremendous priest shortage. So the number, many parishes today are much bigger than they were, or new parishes are far bigger. Now the Catholic Church is almost embracing these mega parishes. But one of the questions we ask questions about reasons why you don't go to church, to Mass more often, or why you go as often as you do. And within those sort of sets of questions, people who don't go to Mass as often as they might like to or could go, it's not because the homilies are bad. That's one thing that a lot of Catholics, and Cardinal Dolan in New York has talked about this. He said that he's going to have a special effort because Catholic homilies are terrible. And Andrew Greeley has written about this, and many of you probably know or think that Catholic homilies are terrible. But that's not the reason. It's usually family, health reasons, or they've either young kids or they're minding an elderly parent. It's usually practical things that are stopping people. And by the same token, one of the questions looked at whether they found their current parish too big and impersonal, and that wasn't the case. So that was we were surprised by that, because we thought with the fact that so many parishes have expanded, in the last, 20 years. There used to be, I think, one priest for every 1,600 people, and now every 1,600 Catholics. Now it's about one priest for every 3,600. And of course, again, that varies by parish, but there really is clearly a shortage on the ground. But people are not saying that they find their parish too impersonal, which might surprise some people. And many, in the large percentages, are open to the idea of women priests, for example. So another set of questions that we asked were, do you favor women in the role of altar server, deacon, Eucharistic minister, all the roles that women have in the church? And large percentages of men and women and Hispanics and non-Hispanics. There's basically 90% are in favor of all those things. About 60% favor women priests. right? And that's pretty consistent. In fact, it hasn't. In fact, it could have been higher, but that 60% has sort of hovered there for the last good while. But then, so it looks like Catholics are open to change. They're ready to embrace alternatives to the traditional understanding of what a parish is, and there's a lot of that going on, certainly in New England, of reconfiguring parishes. But then in another set of questions, we asked that, do you think it'd be a good idea, or whatever, I should have the exact wording, if, for example, priests who left the church and got married were allowed to come back, if married priests were allowed to, it's not just Episcopalians who are allowed now as married men, but have Catholic priests, and then if celibate women or if married women. And lo and behold, everybody, men and women, Hispanics and non-Hispanics, are far more likely to strongly endorse the idea of having the married priests, male priests, than the women priests, right? So on the one hand, people are in favor of women's ordination, but that, the iconography, if you like, of the male priest is hard to just forget overnight. I mean, all of these Catholics, young and old, have grown up with the male priest presiding at the altar. That's a very symbolically strong image in one's head, no matter how liberal one is. And so when you're given these scenarios one after the other, people are more likely to favor the men. Married is fine, but they're still preferable than women, whether they're married or single. So these are, as I said, theologians don't seem to think there are real theological problems with having women priests, but there are still cultural barriers, even in the US, about having women as priests. It's not just, in other cultures. But then on the other hand, work by Ruth Wallace some years ago, she looked at mostly rural parishes that were having a woman as a pastoral administrator. These were sort of the early parishes that were who experienced the priest shortage. And she did in-depth interviews and sort of mini ethnographies of some of these parishes. And she found that while there was a lot of resistance initially, once the woman was in place, the parishioners really just loved, it was sort of the good news, I suppose, depending on your perspective.
Our parish is one of 8 in the diocese that has a female director. The most recent one is the Jesuit Church on Sunset Boulevard, which not surprising that the Jesuits would do that. In terms of size, St. Monica's Parish in Santa Monica has 10,000 families.
Wow. Right.
Holy Family in South Pasadena has 5,000 families. And but a woman parish life director. Right. So it may well be that Camel's got his or her toe in the tent. Things will move, but the signals coming from Rome in the last 6 months have been disappointing.
Right. Well, the issue that really ultimately raises is, I was at the beginning talking about the Mass as being core, the Eucharist, and an awful lot of Catholics, whether they're so-called liberals or conservatives, they can converge around the importance of the Mass to their Catholic identity, even though, as I say, people don't go as weekly as they used, or they don't go as often as they used. So to me, it really raises this, identity issue for the Church, that if as the Catechism says, the Eucharist is at the core, it's the alpha and the omega, it's really the heart and soul of being Catholic. So the issue really becomes not just a pragmatic question that there's a priest shortage, but the whole theological and communal identity of Catholicism is on the line if Catholics have to forgo the Mass in favor of non-Mass related liturgies, for example. So really, in a sense, it's sort of an identity crisis or a legitimation crisis for the Church in some sense to proceed. Because if it is such a core piece, then if we can't have the full celebration of the Mass, what will Catholics have both theologically but also communally?
I have a question regarding you had mentioned that 58% of Hispanics identify as Catholic. So I guess 42 would identify as non-Catholic.
Right.
Is there any data showing whether first, second, or third generation or monolingual Spanish, bilingual or monolingual English plays a part in staying or leaving the Church?
I haven't seen data on that, partly because, even though, as I say, Hispanics have been in America, for hundreds of years, in terms of recent survey data, there's too small a percentage of Hispanics in any of these national surveys. So this current millennial generation will really be the generation to track, to see how many of them sort of stay Catholic or how many embrace Pentecostalism or other traditions. So that's a very good question, and it goes back to your question as well.
Last question.
Yeah, I don't know whether your survey is unique, but it would seem to me that these surveys should have been conducted for long periods of time, so that the Catholic bishops particularly here in the United States, could be dealing with them, because the reaction that I have is that, well, we all knew they were issues, but no one seems to be doing a thing about them, because there are solutions to many of these problems without giving up some of the basic core precepts that the Catholics have. And so I guess my question is, are they doing it? What happens to this information? Is it just for us to discuss and you to discuss in your class? Does it kind of drift off the edge? Or does somebody really think that that's meaningful and do something about it?
Well, I think that's a great question.
Do you really want to answer that?
I do want to answer it because, for many, this University of Wisconsin sociologist Richard Schoner many years ago documented the coming shortage of priests, all demographic data, right, showing the distribution of priests, the distribution of the Catholic population, whatever. He was condemned publicly by bishops in America that this is meddling in church affairs. Andrew Greeley, some of you may know him, he's a bit of a character, but he really kept sociology of religion alive, not just sociology of Catholicism. He was the first one to do all of these amazing surveys, back in the 60s and into the 70s, and to fund religion questions in the General Social Survey. He was quite friendly with many bishops, but they wouldn't look at his data, right? And, so we do these studies. I mean, a lot of the dioceses have their own internal research units. So that's, so they are interested. But then they don't want to, in some sense, to know, because they don't want the interpretation. They're a little defensive about it, and they'll say, we don't run the church based on opinion polls. But sociologists are not saying you need to run the church based on opinion polls, but this is a very lived experience of Catholicism that might be helpful for you if you want to keep, being relevant. So that's the issue, and I think
even if you publish it, they probably wouldn't read it,
or at least they won't admit that they read it. I mean, some bishops do. Bishop Kikanis in Tucson is a big user of this, and there's some bishops are, but I think increasingly the bishops in the last few years are becoming less open to, because I think they feel defensive. I mean, and I think that's what you see coming out of the Vatican is a lot of this threat of secularism that Pope Benedict has talked about. Whereas I would argue, yes, secularism is a threat because it's part of life, but churches are well able to cope with secularism.
This is what causes secularism. The lack of appreciation of what you have.
Right, but it's also lack of engagement. So it becomes this defensive attitude. And so then, for example, like what's happening in Ireland now is because they don't have an understanding of church as the people of God. They think of the church as the hierarchy. Now that the hierarchy has been so badly damaged through all of these sex abuse issues and reports of them, the Catholics of all generations are just not in church. So they're totally going the secular route. I mean, it may change, but and right now there's a lot of economic issues in Ireland, so there's no sort of moral conscience voice even. Not that it has to be a Catholic voice, but it's really an interesting vacuum at the moment. And I don't think American Catholicism is ever going to go in that direction. I think there's too much ownership in America of what religion is, but it's not necessarily getting help from the bishops.
Great. Thank you, Michele.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you very much.